Imagine you've taught a client to request a snack by saying cookie, but they only say it in the kitchen with you present. That's a failure of generalization, and it's one of the most common pitfalls in behavior analysis. In this video, we'll break down stimulus and response generalization, two core concepts from the 6th edition BCBA task list that you must master for the exam. We'll cover the precise definitions of stimulus versus response generalization, compare them with the 3 types of generalization in ABA, and walk through 4 evidence-based strategies to promote generalization in practice. You'll also learn how to design generalization procedures, task G.15, and distinguish generalization from maintenance, a critical distinction for intervention durability. These topics appear across multiple exam domains, especially G and H, so understanding how to program for and measure generalization will help you answer scenario-based questions with confidence. Let's build that foundation now. Now, let's clarify the critical distinction between stimulus and response generalization, both of which are foundational for the BCBA exam under task list item B.14. Stimulus generalization occurs when a behavior happens in the presence of new stimuli that share features with the original training stimulus. So a child who learns to say dog when seeing a neighbor's golden retriever may also say dog when seeing a different breed, because those stimuli belong to a common stimulus class that evokes the same response. Response generalization, on the other hand, involves emitting different but functionally equivalent responses that produce the same reinforcer in the same context. So that same child might also say puppy or bark woof, each being a different response within a response class that all lead to the same reinforcing outcome, like attention or a treat. On the exam, you'll be asked to distinguish these two. Stimulus generalization is about spreading across similar antecedents, while response generalization is about varying the behavior itself. Mastering this distinction is a frequent test item, so practice identifying which type is at play in real-world scenarios. This slide introduces the 3 core types of generalization you must master for the BCBA exam: stimulus generalization, response generalization, and maintenance. Stimulus generalization occurs when a behavior happens in the presence of untrained stimuli that share physical or functional features with the original training stimulus, like a child saying car when seeing a truck. This is promoted by using multiple exemplars during teaching and is critical for real-world application of skills. Response generalization, in contrast, involves different responses producing the same outcome, such as greeting someone by waving or saying hi. These responses are functionally equivalent. You promote this by reinforcing varied topographies, which enhances behavioral flexibility. Finally, maintenance refers to behavior persisting after intervention ends, like a child continuing to brush teeth. It is promoted by thinning schedules and using natural reinforcers while fading artificial ones. On the exam, you will need to discriminate between these types, identify examples, and know how to program for each to ensure durable, generalized behavior change. To promote generalization, BCBAs must go beyond simply teaching a skill in one context. The slide outlines 4 key strategies you'll likely see on the exam. First, teaching multiple exemplars means exposing the learner to varied stimuli and response examples during training. This helps ensure the behavior occurs with different people, settings, or materials. Next, programming common stimuli involves embedding natural cues from the real environment into training, so those same cues trigger the behavior outside the session. Training loosely means varying non-critical aspects like the instructor, time, or location, which prevents the learner from only responding under rigid conditions. Finally, incorporating natural contingencies means using reinforcers that occur naturally in the environment, such as social praise or access to activities, so the behavior is maintained without artificial rewards. On the exam, you may be asked to identify which strategy is being used in a scenario, or to select the best approach for a given generalization challenge. Understanding these distinctions is critical for designing effective, durable behavior change. This slide clarifies the critical distinction between stimulus and response generalization, both of which are core concepts for the BCBA exam. Stimulus generalization occurs when the same response is emitted across different stimuli, such as a child saying ball to both a soccer ball and a basketball. The key variable here is shared stimulus features like shape or color. Response generalization, in contrast, involves different responses to the same stimulus, like saying ball or throw to request a ball, with a focus on response topography or form. For the exam, remember that task G.15 asks you to design procedures for each. For stimulus generalization, you might train across multiple exemplars, while for response generalization, you would reinforce varied response forms. Measurement also differs. Probe untrained stimuli for stimulus generalization, but count different response forms for response generalization. A common error to avoid is overgeneralization in stimulus generalization, like calling all men dad versus a narrow response repertoire in response generalization, such as using only one greeting. To design effective generalization procedures, a BCBA must first identify target stimuli, the specific settings, people, and materials where the behavior should occur, so programming is intentional rather than assumed. Using multiple training examples, such as teaching with at least 3 different exemplars, prevents narrow stimulus control and broadens the range of cues that evoke the behavior. Incorporating natural reinforcers is critical because generalized behavior must contact real-world consequences to persist. Otherwise, it may extinguish. Fading artificial prompts systematically ensures the behavior transfers from controlled teaching conditions to natural discriminative stimuli. On the exam, you'll be asked to evaluate or design generalization plans. So remember that monitoring across untrained contexts is the only way to confirm generalization has actually occurred. Finally, planning for maintenance by thinning reinforcement and transferring to natural contingencies ensures long-term behavior change. This sequence aligns with G.15, where you must demonstrate how to systematically program for generalization rather than hoping it happens spontaneously. This slide clarifies a critical distinction you will need for the exam. Generalization is about behavior occurring in new contexts or forms, while maintenance is about behavior persisting over time after intervention ends. Notice how generalization focuses on spreading across stimuli, responses, or settings, whereas maintenance focuses on durability across time. On the exam, you will measure generalization using probes in untrained conditions, but for maintenance you collect follow-up data weeks or months later. The promotion strategies also differ. Generalization is enhanced through multiple exemplars and loose training, while maintenance relies on schedule, thinning, and natural reinforcers. Task list items G.15 and G.16 directly correspond to these concepts. So expect scenario-based questions asking you to identify whether a client is demonstrating generalization to new settings or maintaining a skill after intervention withdrawal. A common confusion is mixing these up, so remember, generalization expands behavior's reach. Maintenance keeps it going. To promote generalization, BCBAs follow a systematic process that begins with assessing the current repertoire, pinpointing which stimuli and responses the learner already generalizes, which establishes a baseline for intervention. Next, you plan strategies by selecting evidence-based tactics, such as multiple exemplars, common stimuli, or loose training, tailored to the learner's unique needs and context. During implementation, you conduct teaching sessions that systematically vary stimuli and responses while consistently reinforcing correct behavior, ensuring the learner contacts reinforcement across different examples. Finally, you evaluate and adjust by collecting data across untrained conditions, like novel settings or people, and modify procedures if generalization is not observed. For the BCBA exam, remember that this process mirrors the scientific method. Assess, plan, implement, evaluate. You may be asked to identify which step is missing in a scenario or to recommend a tactic based on assessment data. Mastering this sequence ensures you can design interventions that produce meaningful, durable behavior change beyond the training environment. On this slide, we're breaking down 3 core concepts that drive generalization, a must-know for the BCBA exam. First, stimulus class formation. When stimuli share physical or functional properties, like all red objects signaling stop, they evoke the same response class. This is built by pairing multiple stimuli with reinforcement and measured through generalization probes. So on the exam, think of how a client learns to respond to various red items. Next, response class expansion. Different topographies, like saying please or handing a card, produce the same outcome. By reinforcing varied responses, we boost behavioral flexibility, a key goal in intervention. Finally, generative performance. Untrained responses emerge from trained ones, linked to stimulus equivalence and relational frames. For example, learning big leads to bigger through multiple exemplar instruction. This is critical for language and academic skills. Expect questions on how to program for novel, untrained responses. Mastering these concepts helps you design generalization strategies that stick. As you prepare for the BCBA exam, it's crucial to recognize that generalization isn't always successful. 4 specific pitfalls can derail it. Overgeneralization occurs when a learner responds to stimuli that are too dissimilar, like calling every 4-legged animal dog, which indicates the response is too broad. Conversely, undergeneralization means the behavior fails to occur in relevant settings, such as a child only requesting in the therapy room but not at home. Faulty stimulus control happens when an irrelevant feature, like the therapist's voice alone, controls the behavior, so the learner can't respond to others. Finally, lack of maintenance describes when behavior fades after intervention ends because natural reinforcement is insufficient. On the exam, you'll need to identify these pitfalls and scenarios and know how to program for generalization by using multiple exemplars, teaching across settings, and thinning reinforcement to promote maintenance. Understanding these errors helps you design interventions that produce durable, generalized behavior change. To measure generalization outcomes, BCBA candidates must move beyond training data and systematically assess whether behavior occurs under untrained conditions. This slide outlines key probe types, presenting novel stimuli that share features with training items to see if the target response emerges, observing whether functionally equivalent responses appear in the same context, and collecting data in natural settings like home or community to verify stimulus generalization across locations. Follow-up probes, scheduled weeks or months later, evaluate maintenance over time, a critical exam distinction between generalization and durability. Using multiple data sources, direct observation, caregiver reports, and permanent products provides a comprehensive picture, reducing the risk of false conclusions. Finally, graphing generalization data on line graphs allows visual analysis of whether behavior reliably occurs in untrained conditions. On the BCBA exam, expect scenario-based questions asking which probe type best assesses a specific generalization concern, such as whether a learner can use a MAND across different listeners or settings. On this slide, we're comparing stimulus generalization and stimulus discrimination, 2 foundational concepts for the BCBA exam. Generalization means responding to similar stimuli, like saying hi to all adults, while discrimination means responding only to a specific stimulus, such as saying hi only to the teacher. The key difference lies in the breadth of stimulus control. Generalization produces broad control, discrimination narrow control. For the exam, remember that TCO task B.14 covers stimulus generalization, and B.13 covers stimulus discrimination. Teaching strategies differ. Generalization is fostered through multiple exemplars and loose training, whereas discrimination relies on differential reinforcement and prompt fading. A critical balance is needed. Too much generalization leads to overgeneralization, responding to irrelevant stimuli, while too much discrimination leads to undergeneralization, failing to respond to appropriate similar stimuli. On the exam, you'll need to identify which process is being demonstrated in scenarios and select the correct teaching strategy to achieve the desired outcome. To succeed on the BCBA exam, you must clearly distinguish stimulus generalization, the same behavior occurring under different antecedent conditions, from response generalization, where different behaviors emerge in response to the same stimulus. Task list items B.14 and G.15 are critical. B.14 tests your ability to identify these generalization types, while G.15 requires you to design and evaluate procedures that promote generalization. Core strategies from Stokes and Baer, multiple exemplars, common stimuli, loose training, and natural contingencies are your go-to tactics for exam scenarios. Remember, generalization must be directly measured using probes in untrained conditions. Never assume it happens automatically. Also link generalization to maintenance. Without planning for both, through schedule thinning and natural reinforcers, your intervention is incomplete. Watch for common traps like confusing overgeneralization with undergeneralization or mixing up generalization with discrimination. Mastering these distinctions and strategies will help you avoid costly errors on exam day. As you prepare for the BCBA exam, remember that generalization is the ultimate measure of meaningful behavior change. It's not enough for a client to respond correctly in one setting. They must do so across people, places, and time. You've learned to distinguish stimulus generalization, responding to similar stimuli, from response generalization, varying behaviors to achieve the same outcome. And you know that both require intentional programming, not luck. The 4 strategies: teach sufficient exemplars, train loosely, use indiscriminable contingencies, and program common stimuli, are your practical toolkit for designing interventions that stick. Avoid the common pitfalls of teaching in only one context or failing to plan for maintenance, and always measure generalization outcomes directly. On exam day, expect scenario-based questions asking you to identify which type of generalization is occurring or which strategy to apply. Now, go review those comparison tables and practice with mock questions. You've got the concepts, so turn that knowledge into exam day confidence.